Hi everyone. Before we get started, I would just ask that you rename your screen name to your first and your last name. To do that, if you highlight your name, hover over your name in the participants box and click the More button, there's an option to rename yourself. Please make sure that you have your first and last name included. That will help us for attendance purposes. And then towards the middle of this session, I will ask all of you to put your emails into the message box so that we can evaluate continuing education credits. Thanks.
You need to mute your mic.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Justin Dwyer. I'm currently serving as president of Illinois Environmental Health Association. Thank you for everyone attending our spring virtual conference. I know when we were making the decision of what we were going to do back in January, we weren't really sure where COVID numbers were going to be and everything else. So we decided just to make it easier on everybody that's still working in COVID and maybe some restrictions on traveling. So we decided to go ahead and do the spring conferences as virtual. So definitely looking forward to it. I think we've got a wonderful speaker lineup and should be a great conference. Once the conference, we get to the last day, we'll go ahead and release the CEU forms. You can go ahead and fill those out and email them back to the email address provided on that form. Please make sure you initial and sign everything and complete the form, and then we will go ahead and email back the CEUs. If there's any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And that's pretty much it. So I hope everyone enjoys the conference.
Okay, thank you, Justin. I'm now going to turn it over to Sarah Brubaker from Tazewell County Health Department. Her session is on nitrate cluster study and public health education. And Sarah, you should have screen sharing abilities.
All right. Can you see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, like they had already mentioned, my name is Sarah Brubaker, and I'm an environmental health specialist at the Tazewell County Health Department. And today I'm going to give a presentation about a nitrate cluster study that we started here at the health department, and then also give some information about the public education that we really focus on when it comes to groundwater protection and other groundwater topics. So first, just a really quick overview of what I'll be talking about today. First, I just want to give some background and history of our county, and then also some history of the areas that we focused on during this nitrate study. And then again, the public education, past projects, current projects, and this study as well, just different education things that we have done. Then I will talk about what led us to do this project, what things that we were seeing when we were out in the field that made us think we should probably do a little bit more with nitrates in our community. And then lastly, I will talk about the nitrate study that we're doing. It is just kind of getting started. So unfortunately, I won't have a ton of data to share, but it is some good information, and I'll just kind of let everybody know what we've done and where we're at now. So just the basics, what are nitrates? Nitrates are a combination of nitrogen and oxygen. It's naturally found in our environment, and it's common that low levels are naturally occurring in groundwater. But the standard for drinking level, the maximum is 10 micrograms per liters, or ppm, I might say both throughout the presentation. And it's actually really hard to say what is causing the high nitrate levels in a private drinking water well because there's so many sources. So some sources could be from runoff of seepage or seepage from fertilizers from farm fields, wastewater, including septic systems, improperly maintained landfills or dumping, animal lots, or decaying plant debris. And I'll focus on two of these that we see a lot in our county, which is the fertilizer from farm fields, and then also some septic system issues that we've run across. So what are the health concerns when it comes to high nitrates in drinking water? The most common one is blue baby syndrome. So blue baby syndrome reduces the capability of blood to carry oxygen to all parts of the body in infants, especially those who are under 6 months old. And that results in the baby skin to turn blue. So why does it affect infants and not adults? That's because infant stomachs are less acidic, so they're more likely to promote the growth of nitrate reducing bacteria, where adult stomachs produce strong acids, so they don't promote that growth. So that's why when we are educating people and testing people's water. We're really focusing on those under 6 months. Okay, so one common misconception that we see when we are educating our community about high nitrates is a lot of people believe that they can boil their water to reduce the nitrate levels. And I think that may have to do with the boil orders that can sometimes be issued on public water wells due to a main break or a loss of pressure. So some people believe that they can boil their water to decrease the nitrates, which actually is not true. Boiling water can increase the concentration, so it actually evaporates off the water and leaves the nitrates behind, making the concentration higher in the small amount of water that could be left. So that's a common thing that we like to educate people who do end up with high nitrates in their water. And then there are a couple options for treatments. The most common that we see in our county is the ion exchange and the reverse osmosis. And we also see two different kinds of those treatment systems as well, either point of use or point of entry. So the point of use system would be something that's like under the kitchen sink that is directly at where the water is going to be used. And then point of entry would be like a whole house system. And we see both of these in our homes and some of our businesses as well. Okay, so what percentage does the system remove? Because we see such a high amount of nitrates in our water, we really like to share that there's different treatment options that take out different percentages or are rated to take out certain percentages of nitrates. So we want to make sure, we do have some homes that are greater than 20 on their nitrate results. So we wanted to make sure that we make the point to educate them about the treatment options, and they know that if it is greater than 20, then they should have one that reduces the nitrates by at least 50%. And then just another note, not all types of filters and disinfections work to remove the water. So again, the most common ones that we see are the ion exchange and the reverse osmosis. All right, so then just some quick history of Tazewell County. Tazewell County is the one that's noted in red on the map on the right side of the screen. We're right along the Illinois River. We do have quite a bit of homes that are along different rivers as well. There are some areas throughout our county that have very small lot sizes. So we do have a lot of properties that have variances because the septic system may be too close to the sand point or the drilled well that might be on the property. And we also have a lot of irrigation and farming fields throughout our county. We have a lot of neighborhoods that are completely surrounded by farm fields as well. And in one area of our county, we actually have a couple of vegetable fields that are owned by a name brand vegetable company. So there might be a little bit more chemical and fertilization used in those areas. So just again, some more basic information. What's a sand point or a driven well? You can see on the right, that's actually a picture of a sandpoint well in our county that's in the focus area of our project. So I'll kind of get into the focus area a little bit later on. But this is a picture from an inspection that we did of a sandpoint well with a suction pump on top that was actually in kind of like a well house underneath a staircase. Going down to the lake actually. So it was outside of the home, this one was, but we do have quite a few that are inside of the home or the business, maybe in a basement or a crawl space, or sometimes they're just in a closet. So since the driven wells are usually constructed in more permeable sandy soils with a high water table, they're more susceptible to contamination from land use. Like we said, our most common ones that we would see would be the fertilizer use and the septic systems. So we have like 2 or 3 areas that we're really focusing on in our nitrate project. So this is one of them. This isn't the main one that we've started on, but is one that we plan on getting to. It's in an area that has high nitrates. They recently switched from shared semi-private wells to the homeowners having their own private wells. So that's just kind of a fact of something that we've seen over the last couple of years. This is one that is a neighborhood that is completely surrounded by farm fields. So there's just a, small neighborhood, a couple of streets, and on each side of it is farm fields. And we just saw an increase here when it was shared semi-private wells. The nitrates were below 10, maybe around 10. But over the last few years, we did see an increase to 10 or higher in the private wells in this neighborhood. All right, our next focus area, this is actually the main focus of our study where we started to get the information in to push everything out to. Just a fun fact about this area, it is on a lake and the lake turns over about every 17 days. So just an interesting fun fact about this area. Some more information about this neighborhood. They're very small lots. A lot of them are right along the lake. So, that does cause some issues for placement of septic systems as well on the properties. So we do have a lot of variances in this area for the distance to the septic to the well. And these homes in this area were meant to be seasonal homes when they first built up this area, but over time they've become a permanent residence at a lot of the homes. So that has caused some homes to outgrow their septic systems, so they need replacement systems and possibly new wells if they're being used more than what was originally thought. And then to the right is just a picture of that area so you can kind of see what it looks like. All right, then just some more information about our area. Most of Tazewell County's water comes from aquifers or groundwater. We have very little water that comes from surface water. The Muhammad Aquifer is our main aquifer that is used for our private wells. And we do have one surface water well in Tazewell County, but it's at a private residence and it's not in the area that our study is at. So it's not an area of concern. And then this is just a map to the left that shows where the Muhammad Aquifer runs through. So you can see it goes through several different counties, but it does cover most of Tazewell County where our high nitrate clusters were found. So Tazewell County Health Department is a part of the Central Regional Groundwater Protection Committee. And this committee consists of a lot of different local industries, local units of government, counties, states, different planning groups, and then again, local health departments in the central region are also a part of this committee. And the mission of this committee is to advocate groundwater protection practices and procedures to municipal, county, state, and other locals or other local units of government throughout the central planning region. So there's 4 goals of this committee. The first one is to provide educational materials and programs regarding general groundwater protection. The next one is to promote the use of groundwater protection tools to county and other local units of government that implement groundwater protection programs throughout the region. Assist the state jurisdictions in accomplishing specific regional groundwater protection programs. And then last one is to provide a forum for the development of recommendations that address committees' recognized regional protection needs. So our main focus throughout this project and a lot of what I've done while I have been a part of the Central Regional Groundwater Committee is the education. So that's what I'm really going to focus on, is that first goal of education. So providing education, like I said, that's our first goal of the group. So this is just a list of different educational materials or programs that we've put on throughout the years. Some are still ongoing that we do every single year. Some are things that we've done in the past. So the first one, Environmental Education Day. support the Clean Water Celebration. So that's a large event that's held at the Peoria Civic Center. And the CRGW committee usually does set up a booth there to talk about groundwater. Groundwater Awareness Week, which is actually this week, Fix a Leak Week, flooding. Like I mentioned before, we do have a lot of homes that are along rivers or bodies of water. So we do have some areas where when the snow melts or we get heavy rain, that wells can have some flooding around them or some ponding around them. So during those times of heavy rains or snow melting, we always promote that the homeowners test their wells to make sure that no contamination got into the well. And we send out social media posts. Sometimes we'll do a press release to let these people know that we will offer the bottles for free. So no cost to them at all. They can come into the health department, get a sample bottle, and we can test it for bacteria. The Awesome Aquifer kits, those were gifted to us by the Groundwater Foundation. So we were able to use those throughout the county, and then other local surrounding counties got some as well to deliver to our teachers. So the teachers can provide groundwater protection lessons into their school days. So they're just like a little, basically it's just a small aquifer that the students can use, and there are different activities that they can do with them. The prescription drug take back program, and then the arsenic testing program is one that we have done in the past, and we haven't recently been doing that, but that is an educational program that we've done before because of high arsenic results in some of our water. So just a little bit more information on some of those programs. The take back, prescription drug take back program, this was one that we used to have before, and then we were able to start it back up under different grants. And we actually have 2 cities right now that have permanent drop-off sites. So residents are able to bring old prescriptions to a drop-off site instead of, maybe them being misused or being flushed in the toilet and then getting to our groundwater. So we have 2 sites that can be used all year round. And then we also participate in the National Drug Take Back Day. So in 2021, Tazewell County alone had 728 pounds that were collected during this event. So that's a lot of prescription drugs that may have been flushed. So instead, they're getting dropped off at these take back events to keep them out of the water. Other education, like I said, today or this week is the National Groundwater Awareness Week. So Tazewell County Health Department is celebrating by offering residents that are on a private water well free bacteria testing. So all they have to do is come to our office during this week, get the bacteria bottle, and they'll get it for free. And along with that is some more educational information that we gave out during this week about nitrates. And this was posted on our Facebook page, our Instagram page, and we also had a press release about this program so we could get the word out to our residents. Okay, there we go. And then the next thing here, a big part of our education program that we do is an environmental education day. So unfortunately, the last few years have been held virtually, so we weren't able to get the kids together in person. But in the past, this was held in a large event space where we would have about 200 to 300 students come out for the day. And we'd have like 15 to 20 presentations just about environmental education, groundwater protection, some aquifer information, which I'll show next. And the kids were able to experience a lot of hands-on activities during this event. But like I said, due to COVID, we did have to move our event virtually. So in order to still accommodate and get the education out to the teachers, we pre-recorded videos and we collected all the supplies that were needed for the activities and dropped them off to the students at the teachers at their classrooms. And then we sent them the links to the videos for the activities that we had. And we actually saw a large increase of students participating when we moved it to virtual. So in 2021, we actually had 438 students participate, which was, 100 to 140 students more than we saw in the past. So teachers didn't have to use a field trip day or arrange the buses. So they really took advantage of it being virtual. Unfortunately, even though it says we look forward to seeing you in 2022, we did decide to, again, make this event virtual event. So we did survey the teachers to see whether they wanted it to be virtual or in person. And we kind of had a split vote, but just because of some other logistic reasons, we did decide to hold the event virtual again this year, but we will be having an event this October again. Edible Aquifer is a presentation that we have at every Environmental Education Day. The students really enjoy it because, of course, they get sweet treats and some snacks during the event. So when it's held in person, these are the items that we use to symbol what an aquifer would look like. So we use the ice and the soda to be like the saturated sand, gravel, the water, unconfined area of the aquifer. The cookie would symbolize like an aquatard, and we use fudge stripe cookies that have a hole in them. So they're able to put the straw through the hole in the cookie. Ice cream goes on top, which is the unconfined aquifer. And then we offer them contaminants. So we say, do you want medical waste for cherry syrup, or do you want chocolate syrup, which symbolize oil contamination? And then we have the students drill a well using the straw. So they put the straw through all the ingredients through the center of the cookie, and the cup is clear, so they're able to see, did any of those contaminants go down into the sand and gravel layer of the aquifer? And most of the time it does. And then we have the students draw water through their well. So they just drink out of the straw, and then they can again see how much contaminants may come up the straw when they take a sip. So this is an example of that edible aquifer when we did it in person. So we use a clear cup so you can see all the layers of the aquifer. We have a individual who explains all of this, the layers, and why it's important to, not dump things on the ground, and why groundwater protection is so important. And then they get to eat the ice cream. We also use our groundwater model when we are educating students, and we use this, like I said, at the different educational programs that we have. So that might be the Environmental Education Day, the Clean Water Celebration, or a school just asks us to come out and do some education. We'll take this with us. So there's water that actually flows through the model, and then we're able to put dye drops into certain areas that may have contamination. So for example, we could put like a red dye into the septic tank, part of this groundwater model. And then you can see the red dye moving through the layers of the sand and gravel. And you can especially see it when you draw water up from one of the wells. So it does have a like a syringe piece that you can put into the wells to draw water up. And sometimes, depending on how long it's been flowing, you can see some red water come up in the wells. So it's a really great visual for students to be able to see the layers like this and how it works. Of course, it's a sped up version of it, but it's really a great tool to be able to use when educating the kids. So I don't play this, but this is a video of the virtual one that we did over the last few years. So unfortunately, we weren't able to use the ice cream and some of the same material since we did have to send them to the schools prior to the event. So you can see we use different types of cookies. So the students actually cracked the cookies before they put them into the cup. We used fruit snacks for the sand and gravel. We used pudding instead of the ice cream, and then the apple juice, and nerds were the contamination. Okay, so next, why this project? What led us to decide to take action with nitrates and do some public education?
Chicago.
So there's 3 reasons, and this is just some of our routine work, at the health department. First, during our new wells, if we took a sample or whether we did a screening. We were seeing some higher results than normal. Some of the things we were seeing during our operational inspections for wells, and then also some things we are seeing with our non-community program. So first, the new wells. So every time a new well is drilled in our county, we complete an inspection. Unless it's requested, we don't actually take a lab sample for nitrates, but we do a nitrite screening. So we inform the homeowner that no, you're probably not going to get an exact number of where your nitrates may be, but we'll give them an idea of whether or not they should get a lab sample done. And then whether their nitrates come back acceptable or unacceptable during that screening, or if we send a lab sample in, we always send nitrate information to the homeowners. We know that nitrates can fluctuate throughout the season, and we know that we do have a lot of areas that have high nitrates. So we feel that's really important to educate all of our homeowners about nitrates. So to the right of the screen, that's the handout that we send currently to our homeowners. That's only half of it. And you can see there's a lot of words on there. And it's not very easy to read. So as part of this project, I have created a different version of this handout with the same information that I have a little bit later on. So I'll point it out when we get there. And then if we do have a screening result that's very high, we of course notify the homeowner immediately. And then we also recommend that they get a lab sample done so they know exactly where they're at. So if they do decide to get a treatment system, they're able to know the percentage that it should be able to treat. We also utilize the private water well website. That website has a lot of really good information for homeowners. So a lot of times we have homeowners that are living in a home on a well for the first time. So they might not be as familiar with, some of the testing that we recommend, or just how to be on a house with a private water well. So we really encourage people to take a look at that website. And then again, besides the nitrates handout, we also have an arsenic in the water handout that we send. Like I mentioned earlier, we do know we have some areas with higher arsenic, so we send that handout to them as well. We send a safe water well initiative guideline and then a well owner's guideline as well. So that all goes to the homeowner once we complete our inspection, with the recommendation of sampling their nitrates and bacteria every single year. So next are our operational inspections. The Tazewell County ordinance requires that anytime a home transfers ownership, a septic operational inspection is done. It's not required to have a well operational, but we do see a lot of homeowners decide to just do them both since they're already getting the septic operational inspected. They'll just do the well also. So Tazewell County Health Department environmental health specialists and well drillers are able to complete these well operational inspections when a house sells. And our environmental health specialists, when we do these inspections, most of the time the buyer realtor likes to be there, and we can communicate to the new owners through the realtor. So we can provide them with those same educational handouts that we send to new wells. So they're educated as well about nitrates, arsenic, and then as well the homeowner's guide to living on a private well. And because we know that abandoned wells can be a source of contamination, we always walk the property and just check to see if there's any old wells on the property that are not in use, and make sure that they get abandoned as soon as possible. So this picture is the nitrate test strips, nitrite test strips that we use during our inspections. They're super simple. You just it has the directions on there. I think you just dunk it into the water for 1 second and then wait 30 seconds for the strip to change colors. All right, so this is actually an example of a well operational that was completed in our target area, so our main area that we're focusing on during the nitrate study. So this was a Sandpoint well with a suction pump in the home. So I actually went out to do the inspection. I turned the bathtub on to get the sample for the bacteria test, and the bathtub filled up with sand. So again, we have very sandy soils, so that's why we have a lot of these driven Sandpoint wells. So at that point, when there was sand in the bathtub, I had recommended that a well driller, a licensed well contractor, comes out and takes a look in a little bit more depth of the well. So at that time, the well contractor recommended a new well. So they did end up installing a new driven well, very similar in the same place as the existing one. I do have a diagram, but first just wanted to point out the samples at the bottom. So this home did have a reverse osmosis system under the kitchen sink. So it was a point of view system, not a point of entry. So we wanted to take a screening from the bathtub to know what the untreated sample results would be. And then we took a lab sample from the reverse osmosis. So you can see that the nitrate screening from the bathtub was 20. And then the nitrate lab sample results were 1.9 after the reverse osmosis. So that's a success. We know that reverse osmosis is working for this home. And I believe the driven wells, the Sandpoint wells at this property, the old one was 26 feet deep. And then the new one that they installed after this inspection was 22 feet deep. So these are very sandy soils and a higher water table. So they're shallow wells. So here's a diagram from this home. You can see where this dot is. This was in an addition. That's the old well. And then the new well, again, was put very close to where the old well was. So you can see the back width of the house was about 20 feet, 6 inches. And then the septic system was about 5 feet off the home, 5 to 10 feet off the home. So the well was only, like 30 some feet from the septic system. So this house did have a variance for the well being too close to the septic. And then down at the bottom is a lake. So this property is right on the lake in that focus area. So it didn't leave a lot of room for some additional, septic systems and replacement systems. And again, it's a very small lot, so that's common in this area too. There's just not a lot of room. And then the third area that led us to this project was our non-community facilities. So we've had 3 facilities that have been on quarterly sampling due to their nitrate results being close to 10 or even over 10. And all 3 of these facilities have filled out their required paperwork with the state, and they have signage posted saying that the nitrate levels are high. So if there are any infants, especially those under 6 months, they should be drinking bottled water. All right, so just a little bit of information about these facilities and what we see when we go out to do the inspections. So the first one is a bar. It is in one of our focus areas that we're going to be getting to next, and it needed a replacement septic system. So because they have the capability of serving more than 20 people a day, a class 5 injection well, it would be considered a class 5 injection well for their septic system, which would mean the well had to be 200 feet away from the septic. Which was not possible. Like I said, a lot of small lots. So the bar had to submit a waiver through the IEPA to allow them to install the septic system closer than 200 feet to the well and neighboring wells. Most neighboring wells also did not meet a 200-foot setback. So as part of the waiver, the bar actually sampled all of the surrounding wells as a baseline. So, they could show what the nitrates were in the neighboring homes prior to the septic system being installed. So this is a diagram that was completed prior to the new replacement septic system being installed. So this larger lot is the bar. This circle here in the bar is the well. So this bar has a sandpoint well in their basement. So it's inside the facility. And then the orange highlighted numbers kind of show the closest setbacks to where the new septic system was going to be in. So the neighbor to the left, their well was only 95 feet to the septic system. The one behind them was 145, and then the one to the right was 139. So there were several wells in the surrounding area, the neighbors that didn't meet the 200-foot setback. But the waiver was granted to this facility, so they're able to install their septic system, and all the surrounding homes were notified of the waiver as well. And then these are the sample results at that facility. So in August of 2006, they were 15. In April 2011, they were 17. In December of 2017, they were 21. And then in December of 2019, the new septic system was installed. And then in December of 2020, the results were 16. So that just kind of shows that installing that new septic system did not drastically change their nitrate results. Another facility is a church. This is also in one of our focus areas for the nitrate study project. And this one is a drilled well, so it's not a sandpoint, it is a drilled well. And then, so just some more sample results. In September of 2008, their levels were 11 of nitrate. In December of 2017, they were 25. So at that time, around January of 2018, the facility reached out to a water system company and they asked for suggestions. They wanted to know what they could do to lower the nitrates. Obviously 25 is a very high level, and this being a church, there could be infants that are coming into the church. So the water treatment company suggested that they use an ion exchange system, and the ion exchange system was expected to reduce the nitrates by about 70%. So that would get them to below the 10 where they needed to be. And then this picture is the ion exchange system that is installed in the basement of this church. So prior to the ion exchange, the levels were 25. After the ion exchange system was installed in August of 2018, they were around 9. And then in April of 2019, they were 13. And then we saw a decrease actually in August of 2019, it was 3.5. And in March of 2020, they were 1.5. So they were able to, for the most part, reduce the nitrates below 10, except for that one in April. But again, this is just another thing where the nitrates can fluctuate. So that's why we always push for our homeowners to sample their nitrates and bacteria at least every year. And we also try to recommend that they switch up the seasons that they take it. So if one year they take it in the fall, the next year maybe they try it in the spring, just to make sure that they're not fluctuating too much. And then our last example of our non-community that we saw some issues with that kind of made us decide to look at nitrates a little bit more was another bar, which is very close to one of our studies or our cluster areas. So this facility started with high nitrates. You can see in November of 2007, they're 20.9. And then they kind of stayed around that 18 range in between 2010 to 2015. They did have an old Sandpoint well at that time, and it was suggested to them to try to change from a Sandpoint well to a new drilled well to see if that would decrease the nitrates. So a new drilled well was installed in 2016. So after that well was drilled, a sample was taken and the nitrates were 16. So it didn't decrease them too much at that time. And then you can see throughout that time, they stayed around, 8 to 19. So they were continuously increasing and not decreasing like they had hoped during that time. And because of these levels, the bar is posted, and they also have decided to use all canned products, so canned beverages and bottled beverages as well. And they have also used purchased ice before as well. Okay, so the last thing is the actual study. So those are the things that led us to decide to focus a little bit on nitrates, get some more public information out to the areas in these cluster spots. So our first step, we noticed that nitrates were increasing throughout the county. You know, sometimes they were high to begin with and they stayed high. So we knew there was an issue. So the next thing we wanted to do was identify the areas that had these high results. So we used some data that we already had from those inspections. So whether they were operationals, new wells, non-community, semi-privates, or individuals that just wanted to test their well, you know, they were testing annually. We had all that information. And we had our Tazewell County GIS office create a password protected map. So we had data from January 2020 to August of 2021, which was about 129 samples. And we only used confirmed lab samples and not the screenings because we didn't want the ones that were within a range. We wanted the actual confirmed levels. And we only used the data from these dates because around this time, January 2020, is when we switched to an Excel sample log. So prior to that, we had a paper sample log where we documented all of our samples in. So for data collection, it was just much easier at the time to use the Excel information. We do still have the paper log. So if we ever needed to go back and add more samples, we could use the paper log to add more. So this is kind of a zoomed in area of the map. This is where our highest results were. So this is the map that the GIS office gave us. And the really nice thing about this is you're able to click on the orange dots and it gives you the exact address of where that sample was taken and the actual result of the sample. So this is what we used to identify where we wanted to focus. So this top part here in the top left is where we started our first area at, where we focused first. And that's because it may look like there's some areas that have more dots, more larger dots, but in that area, those were the highest. So most of those large dots were, you know, in the 20s. So we wanted to make sure that we focused on them first. So this is just another look at those results. So we did have a lot that were satisfactory, but there are still quite a few that were within that greater than 10 or 10 range. So were we surprised by these results? No, not really. We knew we had high nitrates throughout the county. And again, this was a very sandy area. So in that red circle on that map, the gray color shows where the sandy soil is. So if you look back at the map, this is that area of the sandy soil. So we knew that there was a chance that that would be where the high nitrates were. And although we didn't collect this data, these areas are the areas that have the sandpoint wells. And like we talked about before, driven wells, sandpoint wells are more susceptible to land contaminations like the fertilizers because of the sandy soil. So this shows the entire county map zoomed out. So it just, again, kind of shows you, it's very clear where the clusters are and where our focus areas needed to be. The photo to the left shows where our irrigation wells are in the county. So it also lines up very closely with where we are seeing the high nitrates. So our next step was to notify the area. So we already identified where we wanted to focus. So we have, like I said, created a new nitrates and drinking water handout. We wanted it to be below a 5th grade reading level and easy to read. We knew that some of these areas were lower income, so we wanted to make it as easy as possible. So we created this new document that kind of broke the information up a little bit more. And again, it used the same information, but just kind of lowered the reading level. So along with this handout, we sent a letter explaining that we're doing a research project. Their area was identified to have high clusters with elevated results. And we didn't want to scare anybody. So we tried to keep it as informal as possible to let them know we would never force anything upon them. If they did test and the water was high or the nitrate levels were high, we could help them find resources to get a reverse osmosis or other treatment system installed, but we wouldn't force them to. We really wanted to focus on education. And encourage, of course, we would encourage a treatment system, but we wanted to be clear it wouldn't be forced. And all they needed to do was bring this letter and a sample of their water in a clean container and bring it into our office, and we would screen it right then and there at our office, so they would leave with the results. So then we waited. I mailed about 96 letters and educational flyers to the homes in our first focus area. And unfortunately, 42 of the letters were returned to sender. So we didn't reach as many people as we wanted to. But we did have 2 people who brought in samples to get tested, to get screened, and both were greater than 20. And from that, we did have 1 person who actually purchased a lab test to get further testing, and it was also higher than 20 with their result. So we weren't very happy with that result. You know, we had a lot of people that we just didn't get to because they didn't get the letters, and only 2 people brought in the samples. So our next step, we didn't feel like we could move on to the next focus area until we attempted again to reach out to this area. So our next step was to set up a booth at a sportsman club that's right in that area within walking distance of many of these homes. So we've been in contact with the sportsman club to set up a booth. They would advertise this hopefully in their newsletter and a calendar in their newsletter. So the individuals in this area could bring the sample within walking distance of their home to this event, and we would screen the water there. So we're hoping that this will make it a little easier for the individuals in this area. And also just another way to try to get the information out is being in the newsletter. A lot of people in the area do belong to this club. So we're hoping that we can reach them a little bit better using this sportsman club as a resource. And we also have posters that we can post up throughout the community so they know this event's coming up. So some lesson learned barriers. Obviously, always collect more data than you think. One thing I didn't look at when I was collecting the data was what kind of well the property had. You know, was it a sandpoint well? Was it a drilled well? We do have that data, so I can go back and get it, but it's something that I now wish that I had going through this information. Obviously, we weren't expecting to get so many of the letters returned to sender, so that was a big barrier that we saw. And then one thing very common with environmental health in general is people don't want to know. They believe they've been drinking the water this whole time and they've been fine. So there's no reason to, you know, screen their water for nitrates. They're also concerned that if they do sample and the results are high, then they'll have to disclose that information during a sale of the property. So they just don't want to know what the levels are. So those are just some barriers that we're working through. We're also hoping to possibly show on the map, add another layer of income so we can show the lower income areas. So maybe we can focus the education a little bit differently in those areas. And then if you're looking for more information, the story of this project was in the Stories from the Field on NACCHO's website. So the link's there if you're looking for any more information. And then last is just thank you to the Central Region Groundwater Protection Committee for helping me with this project. They've given me ideas and they've also funded the test strips. So that was very helpful to have them as part of this project. So that's all I have. Thank you very much. So if there's any questions or if people have done similar projects and they have suggestions for how to overcome those barriers or lessons learned, I'd really love to hear them. We want to reach as many people as we can. So we would love to hear suggestions as well. And then that's my email and my phone number.
Thanks, Sarah. There was one question in the chat box. Have you tried partnering with your WIC department to provide educational materials to people with infants? Or have WIC clients living in that area bring a water sample when they come to the health department for their WIC appointments?
We haven't tried that. That's a great idea. I think that's probably something that we can easily do is work with our WIC department to get that information out to those individuals. You know, we're focusing on super small areas right now. So hopefully once we have reached all those areas, we can get this information out to a wider range. Thank you. That's a good idea.
I'm not seeing any other questions, Sarah. So thank you for presenting. I want to remind everyone to please make your name in the participant list, your first and last name. This is important for attendance records. And if you would at this time, please put your email address in the chat box so that we can track your email address for continuing education credits. We'll take a quick break here and our next session will start at 2 o'clock.
Justin, this is Ted Funk, just doing a sound check.
Okay, everyone, welcome back. We'll go ahead and get started. If you've not already done so, please put your email into the chat box to be considered for continuing education credits. I'm now going to turn it over to Ted Funk, and he will be presenting on the Illinois livestock industry. So Ted, you should have sharing rights at this point.
Okay. I'm sure I can do this. All right. Can you see my screen? Okay, I appreciate this opportunity. This is the first time I've addressed this audience. Most of the time I talk to livestock producers, to university folks, and to regulators and so on. So this is the first time I've been able to speak to this group. And I do view it as a great opportunity. And I certainly look forward to your questions. A little bit about my background. I'm an Illinois farm kid from Western Illinois. I grew up in the livestock industry. And most of my career has been in educating livestock producers in Illinois and other places. So for the last 40 years, and 32 of those were working with the University of Illinois, I've been talking to Illinois livestock producers about various aspects of livestock systems. But today we're going to talk about protecting water quality and what the livestock industry does to do that. I have put this slide up here about first some numbers about the livestock production as an industry, and you can read the numbers there about the economic activity and so on and so forth. But I want to just to emphasize that it is an important industry in Illinois. For instance, we are the number 4 hog producing state in the country, and the dairy and beef industries and some poultry as well provide a lot of economic activity and livelihood for a lot of farm families. So along with that, I guess I'd have to say, since I've been involved with, from an educational standpoint, the livestock industry for a good number of years, I feel like I'm well versed with the way they do business, and also I'm pretty proud of the way that they do take care of the environment. But now let's go into some details and see why I feel the way I do. So why is the concern about groundwater and surface water quality? There are recognized mechanisms by which you can have pollution of groundwater and surface water, and I think we realize most of those. So we have the last presentation talked about wells and the potential for contamination of wells, both by improper construction of the wellhead, but also leaching of constituents into shallow aquifers. And there are such things as tile drainage, even ammonia volatilization from farm fields can cause particulates of ammonia or of nitrogen compounds, particulates that show up in surface water. So there are some pathways that contamination can occur, and as I say here, the industry tries really hard to keep it from happening, and I'm going to talk about how they do that. So this groundwater resource we talk about, it's well mapped in Illinois, and most of you are probably familiar with this map that the Illinois State Geological Survey has provided. It shows both the shallow and the deep aquifers where we can get groundwater. And the last presenter talked about the Mahomet Aquifer. We see that blue stripe across the center of the state. So when we talk about vulnerability of these groundwater resources to surface activities, where are those the most vulnerable? And of course, the ones that come to mind right away would be such things as karst regions, and any shallow aquifers would have that coarse textured soil. And we talked about that in the Tazewell County area in the last presentation, where you have sandy soils and shallow aquifers. They are likely to have contamination in them. So once again, recognizing that there are lots of differences across the state and how those aquifers are overlain by different soil types, and some are confined, some are not. So let's see how the livestock industry works to protect the water resources. Also, where do the private groundwater supplies and the livestock production coincide in the state? So it'd be a natural thing to say, well, if you've got high concentrations of livestock production, do you also have a lot of private wells that are using water in that area? And are those the targets for concern? Well, the thing that I find fascinating is this private well database that Illinois State Geological Survey maintains. When you think of over 700,000 well logs in their archive, and you can find those in this interactive database, so you can just go to a blue dot and click on it and see not only the location of the well, but also the depth and the log, the drilling log, to see what various layers the well goes through to get down to usable quantity of groundwater. It's very interesting. We can also, of course, imply that if you are using water to water livestock from groundwater, they may also be accessing the same depth of aquifers, or they may go deeper if they have to have a more water resource. So looking again at the state, and what are these top counties for the livestock species? Of course, some of these are spread all over the state. Some are concentrated. The dairy industry is concentrated in the northwest counties and down in a belt between St. Louis and Effingham. The beef finishing operations are spread pretty much throughout the state. We've got a lot of poultry activity and turkeys in the southeastern counties, and then on North Route 47. And the swine, there are several concentration regions around the state. So to say that there's a possibility of livestock production being in the proximity of these groundwater supplies would certainly be a fair statement. So that they can coincide in lots of different places. While we're talking about water quality and water contamination, let's not forget the surface water quality. And one of those that is really in the limelight right now is the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy, where the state agencies are working very hard to reduce the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus going down the Mississippi River and also into lakes in the state. And we know that agriculture is the large non-point source contributor of nitrogen and phosphorus, and the livestock farms, well, they're part of agriculture. And so we need to talk about where the livestock farms fit in overall agricultural production. Let's go back a little bit in history. In 1972, the Clean Water Act came into being, and there were a lot of changes across the country, and some of those involved livestock agriculture at that time. I started with the University of Illinois Extension back in 1980, and so the Clean Water Act was fairly new back then, and some of these the rules that were being put in place by the states at that time were just being fine-tuned, and some new ones coming up all the time. So that was where my educational involvement started, was teaching producers about the regulations associated with the Clean Water Act, and in Illinois, the Illinois Environmental Protection Act. So there's a lot of aspects here of ag-related environmental pollution control covered in the Illinois Environmental Protection Act, not just non-point source pollution. But I think it is fair to say that there are systems that support pollution control for the farms, and they've been promoted by state and federal government. So on one hand, there are incentives to help farmers do a better job, and there are also penalties or regulations. I found it interesting, this latest round of changes in the Illinois EPA regulations that was put in August of 2014. They have this statement in the policy statement, which is right up front in this section. To prevent pollution of the air and waters of Illinois caused by failure to plan. Failure to plan is kind of a statement that caught my eye there. And the timing is so good because today we're talking about planning of manure management planning and how we've been training producers how to make manure management plans, what goes into those plans, and so on. So for the Illinois EPA to say in its policy statement, they're focusing on preventing pollution caused by failure to plan. That's an interesting way to put that, but let's see how that works in the state. So this manure management plan is something we've been training producers about. And back in 1997, I became the lead for the in the Livestock Management Facilities Act, what we call Certified Livestock Manager training, and that focuses on manure management planning. So all the farms that are above a certain size of animals production are required to go through the training program that we started back then, and I was in charge of that for 15 years. So I've seen a lot of producers come through the training program, and we've talked a lot about details and how to come up with these plans. I like to look at it as the 3 Ps of the manure management plan: the plan, the performance, and the protection. And that plan is, here's what we've got, what we say we're going to do with it. The performance is the records that show what actually happened. And then the protection is extra systems and protocols that we use to protect the environment. So for instance, emergency management systems. While we're talking about this, there's in the news, you always hear about CAFOs. What is a CAFO? Well, it's an acronym that means Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation. And it's something that the federal government came up with. But it's interesting to see just how are those designated? What is a CAFO? Well, there are 3 different sizes of animal feeding operations. And let's take the C off the front of this for just a minute. Animal feeding operation is any confined animal operation of a certain size. And if you put the C in front of it, that implies that facility has a point source discharge. Now that's a tricky one because point source discharge is something that we definitely want to stay away from, particularly in the farming operation, because with livestock production, we look at that as a no discharge system. That is, we're not doing what a municipal sewage treatment plant would do and treat wastewater to then go into a river or stream or lake. We focus on concentrating on the recycling, using all of the manure or the wastewater that we produce on crops. So there is no discharge. However, if we look at that lowest line on the table there, it says large CAFO. Well, why do we put the C in front of it? That's because of the federal regulation that was done back in 2003. The federal government, in their infinite wisdom, decided that anything above a certain size must be a point source discharge, or at least a potential point source discharge. So they said, we're going to call them all CAFOs no matter what size they are. So we have large CAFOs in the state of Illinois. We call them unpermitted large because we do not advocate them having to get an NPDES permit for discharge, because we don't want them discharging, and we do what needs to be done so that they do not discharge as a point source. Nonetheless, you can see what size of operations we're talking about here. So for instance, dairy cows, a small AFO is under 200 milking cows. When I was back on the farm in Western Illinois, the most milk cows we ever milked were about 80. And so to say 200 cows is still small, that kind of boggles my mind on some days. However, we realize that there are a lot of medium AFO dairy farms in the state, a lot fewer than there used to be. In fact, the total number of dairies in the state of Illinois is probably about 1/3 or less than it was when I started an extension back in 1980. So the numbers have really fallen off. The swine facilities, a medium AFO, I've shown one in here in the picture that's on the order of, maybe 2,300 head or so. So 2 little old buildings, that makes them a medium in the swine business. In the beef finishers, it's an easy 1-to-1. One beef animal is one animal unit, and then so large CAFO would be over 1,000. And then the turkeys numbers are pretty large, but realizing that the turkey is a much smaller animal than a beef finisher, so the numbers are certainly large for a large CAFO in the turkey business. Nonetheless, there are some numbers. So if we just throw around the term, oh, that's a large CAFO, you need to know what you're talking about as far as the actual numbers, because it may be in a completely different category altogether. And the regulations are a little bit different. They're more stringent for the large CAFO than they are for the medium and the small. Nonetheless, the idea is, the goal is to have a zero discharge system for whatever size operation we have in the state. We just don't have animal feeding operations that treat wastewater to the point that they can then discharge it to a stream. We don't do that. One of the questions that comes up is about the manure storages. And once again, we see these stories in the paper about, a large manure storage spills and so on. We go to a lot of trouble in the state of Illinois, and I say we, talking from the educational standpoint and also from engineering, but the siting and construction of these manure storages are carefully regulated to prevent the spills and any groundwater contamination. So what we see on the left is a beef unit. We've got some beef cows, finishers. They're under roof. They're over a pit that's got a slotted floor, and the manure is being stored underneath the slotted floor. And those slats are actually covered with rubber mats to make it easy on the feet of the animals. But this is one example of an underfloor manure tank that's carefully designed to engineering standards. More about that in a minute. On the right, we see an outdoor manure storage for dairy. And if you can see the tractor in the background there, the outdoor lots are scraped. The manure is put in this storage for longer term storage, so that can later be taken out to field and land spread. But even those are also carefully engineered, and the construction and placement are regulated. And these designs, they follow the USDA NRCS National Engineering Manual. So the thickness of the concrete, the water stops, all those sorts of things are regulated and have to be stamped by an engineer before the construction begins. And then they're inspected during construction, and then when it's completed, the Illinois Department of Agriculture does those inspections for any and all manure storages. Here's an example of some of the care that's taken in putting these storages in. This is a rare view that you're going to see before the backfilling is complete for this manure tank. This is showing the perimeter drainage tubing. So the requirement is that the manure tank has to have a perimeter drainage tile put around it, so that it can take both for hydrostatic pressure and also to make sure if there is any leakage or anything from the pit, then it's going to be detected and corrected before it affects groundwater. So what we're seeing here is the standpipe on the right. That's a vertical pipe is a standpipe where you can sample the perimeter drain tile. And in this view, we see another example where that's put in place. So the sampling port that you see on the right is the place where you get the perimeter tile water sample, and you periodically send that to the Illinois Department of Agriculture, the results of the sample, to see if there's anything that shouldn't be showing up in that perimeter tile. Okay, and if there's questions later about manure storages, we can address those. But I want to go to manure spreading because this is in some ways a more interesting one, and there are similar, numbers of regulations about how manure is spread and so on. As I've said before, my history goes back quite a ways with livestock systems because when I say these have evolved over 60 plus years, well, that was actually when I started growing up on the farm too. So there have been lots of changes, but we're still doing that recycling thing where we feed livestock, we have manure, restore, transfer, and then we take it out to the field and put it on crops for crop production. And then those feed grains come back and the forages come back to feed the livestock. So it is kind of a circular situation where you're recycling these nutrients around and taking off feed and milk and meat product. So how do we do it? Well, there's some basic assumptions, and we call it, in the last 10, 15 years, they've used this what they call the 4R approach for using the fertilizer. One is that you use the right source of nutrients, and in our case, manure is the right source of plant nutrients. It's got a lot of advantages over just the commercial fertilizer. Also, we put it in the right place, we put it on at the right rate and at the right time. So as I say, these assumptions, first, if manure is the right source, and then manure is placed properly so it doesn't run off, doesn't get away, put at the right rate so it doesn't exceed the soil's water holding capacity, and it doesn't leave the root crop zone, and you get the nutrients that you need for the growing crop, and supplies organic matter that becomes a part of that topsoil. And the timing is important too, because that optimizes the use of the nutrients by the crops while we minimize environmental risk. So let's talk about some of those regulatory restrictions, the constraints on where you put manure. Some of these are related to minimizing runoff of manure to surface water. So there are slope restrictions on where you can apply manure. You can't apply it if the slope is over, for instance, 17%. You can't apply on saturated soil, so watch the weather. There are restrictions on applying to soils in the floodplain, and then in winter, spreading manure on frozen and snow or ice covered ground. There's some severe restrictions on that as well. Restrictions on spreading manure on shallow soils and tile drain soils. So now we're looking at how manure constituents might get down through the soil and then move into either drainage tiles or maybe into fractured bedrock, sand, or gravel, and thereby perhaps cause some contamination. So there are restrictions on what the application rate is over shallow water table soils, and also there are controls and some monitoring required when you are putting manure on in tile drain fields. I show this picture on the right because if you look on, for instance, Google Earth and zoom in on a field and you see stripes through it, like we see here, you can bet that this field is tile drained, and you're seeing the differences in soil moisture by the stripes in the field. So that's just an example of a tile drain field and how we would have some restrictions on applying manure over those tiles. So we watch to see what's going on and make sure we're not losing manure constituents down out to the surface tiles, and thereby causing some surface water contamination. I want to talk a little bit about soil, because we talk about just putting manure out on a field, and many people perhaps haven't thought about what is down underneath the surface. So the soils that we're applying are a combination of mineral, organic material, and then the air and water. And the mineral, you can be classified in some ratio of sand, silt, and clay, and then there's a little bit of organic matter. And air and water make up about half of the soil volume. Think about that now for a minute. Air and water, and those ratios, of course, will change depending on the soil moisture content. But if half of the soil volume is voids, it seems that there should be plenty of places to put manure in that, and without it getting away into the lower strata of the soil. So, and the horizons, the soil horizons we talk about are A, B, and C. The A horizon is the top root zone, and we see our soil scientists looking at that. That's the top, say, foot or so of the soil. Then the B horizon, where we've still got plant roots, and the C horizon, which might be substrata. So we're concentrating on getting manure into that A horizon up near the top, recognizing that there's void space up there to do it. And I've used a little thought experiment here. If folks ask themselves, well, when we put on, for instance, liquid manure on soils, can it even hold it? Can the soil hold that much liquid? So we land apply this liquid manure by gallons per acre in the top 7 inches of soil, and that's where we actually take soil samples. So 7 inches of soil has a volume of 190,000 gallons per acre. And about half of that is void spaces. So we got 95,000 gallons per acre of void space, which is filled with either water or air. And this top 7% is where we concentrate the liquid manure. So we would not put manure deeper than that. And the common application rate I'm showing here, about 5,000 gallons per acre. And naturally, it depends on what's in the manure, and that is calculated, but I'm just showing an example. So about 5% of the void spaces would be filled by a liquid manure application. So if that gives you any comfort level, that are we over applying liquid manure to this soil? Is it just going to have more liquid manure in it than it can possibly hold? I think the answer is no. So back to that nutrient recycling. We're doing a zero discharge system, and we're trying to maintain a balance of the nutrients that are going in the soil. So we're applying these nutrients based on the annual crop growing cycle. And we know what those are. I mean, university tests show us, here's about how much nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium the various crops are going to take up in a year. That's what we expect. And so we feed those crops appropriately. And to some degree, we can kind of bank some of these essential nutrients. So for instance, the phosphorus and potassium exist as cations, and they cling to the soil particles. They don't really get away much. So we can over apply. In some years we can over apply phosphorus and potassium, and those will stay around. They'll still be there for subsequent years. The nitrogen is a slippery one. It's an anion, and it tends to go into soil solution when it's in the nitrate form. So in nitrate form, it tends to go in a soil solution, and as the previous speaker talked about, the nitrate can, in shallow or in the coarse textured soils, can get away and move further down into groundwater. So in Illinois, we are restricted to applying manure based on the nitrogen need of the crop, not the phosphorus or potassium so much, but the phosphorus restriction follows that in some situations. But mainly we're balancing on the basis of supplying the nitrogen, and then whatever phosphorus and potassium concentrations are in the manure, that follows with that. So for this manure management plan to make any sense, we're going to sample it, and we're going to send it to a lab and get it analyzed, because manure is different from one farm to the next, from one pit to the next, and so on. So, and yes, that's me on the right. I get the job of using the sample stick on a dairy manure pond. This is for, we had a field day and I got to pull the sample that day, but they're analyzed for a lot of different things, but the main things we're looking at are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But sometimes the farm wants to get the analysis of other constituents as well, because recognize that manure has a lot of other good things going for it that the crops need. They need micronutrients, they need organic matter, and manure is by far the best fertilizer source that you can get out there, because it carries so many complete things with it. Some folks have asked, well, do we have way too much manure? We just got more manure than we can possibly use. So I did a kind of the back of the envelope calculation on this. How much of the total nitrogen and phosphorus requirements for Illinois crops could we supply with manure? And I'm going to make the story short here, but and just from the 2017 Ag Census data, if we took all the manure produced in Illinois, we could supply about 10% of the nitrogen that was needed for the Illinois corn and wheat crop. If we took all the phosphorus in the manure produced by Illinois livestock, we could supply about 14% of the corn, the soybeans, and the wheat crops. So is in the larger view across the state, do we have too much manure for the crops? Well, no. In fact, we've got, you could say we have a shortage of manure. So it's a logistics issue. How do we get the manure to the crops that need it? Back to that planning, to the record keeping and the reports. Our farms are required to put together field maps of where the manure is going to be applied. So the farmer has to recognize both how much acreage he can apply manure onto and at what rates, but also some of the no-fly zones for the manure spreader. So what I'm showing in this map here on the left is we've got a typical farm field that's going to be receiving manure from a dairy. And the points that you see in red are the no-fly zones for the spreader. So I've illustrated a wellhead up the top in the center. It's got a 150-foot radius around it. So you have to stay 150 feet away from a wellhead when you're spreading manure. Also, you have closer to the center, we've got a waterway, and it has buffer zones around it where you can't spread manure. And on the larger one is the surface water, so it's a stream running along the perimeter of this field. And it has a 200-foot setback where the manure spreader cannot go. And I'll remind you too that this does not apply to commercial fertilizer application, only to manure. But those are the some of the restrictions that are applied to spreading manure on farm fields. And that goes into the record keeping and into what I call the plan and the performance part of the manure management plan. So in this plan, we show how much we've got, where it's going to go, when, and who put it on. And then if we need to revise the plan for the next season, we can do that as well. So if our records show that, well, we plan to put on 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and we only put on 80, then here's what we change to for the next year, so on. There are some incentives out there. So the farm bill that comes out every few years authorizes some public funds to help out with various projects, and one of these is one group is called EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentive Program. This can enable farms to increase size of manure storages, improve manure transport out to fields, put roofs over feedlots, things like that. To all of these to address specific resource concerns to keep from polluting the environment. So to do that, though, you have to follow the rules. And one of the practice standards that NRCS has is called the Practice Standard 590 Nutrient Management. It emphasizes that 4R approach of putting on the right product, right rate, right timing, right placement of your nutrients. but it also includes in it a couple of things, this nitrogen leaching soils risk assessment and the phosphorus index soils risk assessment. Both of those have some constraints on applying manure and where you can put them, what the rates are, and so on. And those are used, if you're going to take money from the Farm Bill programs, you got to play by these rules. And these are what goes into your manure management plan and also in your contract when you're dealing with NRCS. And these environmental quality incentive programs have been really well received over the years by our Illinois producers. And these are just some examples. On the left there we see the grazing enhancement, that's confined or concentrated grazing, rotational grazing programs. The confined livestock, those are the practices such as improved manure storages, putting roofs over feedlots to keep rainwater from washing constituents off the feedlot and so on. And then the comprehensive nutrient management plan, that is a planning process where you have an expert come in and work with the producer to a long range look at the facility and map out what the manure management storage and planning and so on is going to be. And so in that comprehensive nutrient management plan is really the framework for future environmental quality incentive program participation. So as I say, those have been well received, and they are just a good example of how the federal government and the Farm Bill is working with livestock producers to continually improve how we do business. And this other thing, the third P of the manure management planning, the protection part, this includes things as spill prevention and control plan, and also alternatives for how do you manage manure if you got extended inclement weather conditions. So if you got a chronic weather wet period where you thought you're going to be able to spread manure, but you can't, and the manure keeps coming because the animals keep eating. So the protection part is an important part, and this is something we emphasize in our training programs as well. I want to show something that's happened, and I've found this fascinating over the years, how the industry has changed. One of those is the growth of the custom hauler industry. As the livestock industry has grown and concentrated, we see more specialization by the livestock producers, and along with specialization in other areas, such as the feeding, genetics, and so on, there's also a specialization in how we handle manure. And we find this growth of the custom hauling industry, where the custom haulers come in and they have specialized equipment. They got the labor resources that can do a good job, a fast job of taking manure out to the fields and apply it on fields. And many times it's more appropriate equipment even than the individual farmer might have, because you can spread the investment of specialized equipment over a larger number of farms. It also enables these greater hauling distances from the farm. So instead of now hauling the manure to within a mile or 2 miles of the farm, now we can get that manure out maybe 4 miles or 10 miles away and take it to other crop farms where they need the nutrients. Another example, can we put on manure on corn crop in the spring? And this is something that really startled me. I can just imagine somebody saying, you're going to drag this hose across my corn after it's already come up, it's 2 or 3 leaves, and it's you're going to drag this soft hose across it and knock it over, and you expect it to spring back up. Well, it works. It does work, and it's being really promoted in Ohio, but I think it's going to become very popular across the Corn Belt. So what does this do? Well, a couple of things. One is it gets the manure spread closer to the time when the crop is going to be needing to use it, and so we'll have less loss, less nitrogen leaching, and so on. And the other thing is it gives another window to the livestock producer, another time when he can spread manure and have the assurance of enough manure capacity in his storage, so he doesn't have to worry about running out of storage and having to look for alternative places to put manure. So just another example of technology and how it's changing. And this is about a 5-year-old technology of this manure side dressing in the spring with what we call a drag line. Now, that's another point here too. We see that soft hose is supplying manure to the implement that's putting on the manure. This is fascinating because we've always in the past used some kind of a tank, a heavy tank to pull through the field, and that's what carries the manure. Now we're pumping manure all the way from the farm out to this application device. And I'm going to show you some more examples of that in a minute. Here's some other examples, just while we're talking about technology. Nitrification inhibitor, something you can put in liquid manure to slow down the transformation of the ammonium form of nitrogen to nitrate. Remember that nitrate is something we'd rather not have in the soil profile until the crop is ready to use it. So nitrification inhibitor in liquid manure can help hold that back, especially in fall application. In slurry storages, we reduce the water input so we have more capacity for manure, and we also build these slurry storages bigger so we're not so pressed for time as to when we have to apply manure. We can do it when the soil conditions are proper. There's better liquid manure soil injection tools. Show you a picture of those in a minute. Smartphone apps for calculating. There's GPS as applied mapping, so we can show where the manure actually went, what rate. And then even on the go manure and nutrient sampling. This is equipment that's come out in about the last 3 years to actually keep track of the nutrients in the manure as they come out of the tool, instead of just relying on a sample that was taken from the pit. Need to talk about the continuing education efforts, because these go on all the time to help not only manure management planning, but some of the details of how manure is applied. But both the University Extension and industry have been leading these for many years. And so there's regular producer training. That the Certified Livestock Manager program is mandated by the Livestock Management Facilities Act, which came into being back in 1996. We have field days, manure and nutrient management plan workshops, and even training workshops for the custom manure haulers. Technical service provider training, the TSP, technical service provider, that's the professional that goes out and works with the NRCS to make sure that the contracts for these farm bill programs are done right. There are on-farm environmental reviews we call farm gate. So you can go out in an anonymous situation. You can have an expert go out and visit with the farmer individually and look over the situation and see if he needs to make improvements and so on to do a better job of environmental protection. And then there's the industry has put out some resource guides for the Illinois EPA livestock rules. So lots of education going on. There's some other economic incentives for doing a good job with the environmental sustainability. And one of those is the price of nutrients. The price of fertilizer has gone absolutely through the roof in the last few months. And not just with the Ukraine situation, but even before that. So going down to the store and buying commercial fertilizer has become quite an experience in sticker shock lately. We've got some all-time highs in the prices of many of these commercial fertilizers, but particularly the nitrogen. And so the price, the value of livestock manure is much higher than it has been. And so it's going to be very much in demand. What does this mean? This means that the manure is going to be spread thinner over more acres and going to if anything, better utilized than it ever has been to go directly to feeding crops. So there's going to be more demand for off-farm transport and sales of this manure. Real quickly on some of the hardware. We talked about the liquid manure tanker earlier, and there's just an example on the left. It looks huge. It is. It's a very large, multi-thousand gallon liquid manure tank. It's being supplied with all these wheels under it, and you see those are, we call them flotation tires. So we've minimized the amount of soil compaction in the field, and that's important because you want to keep that. We talked about the void space in soil. We want to keep that intact and not squish the soil down where the plant roots can't get through it. On the right, we see one of the newest injection tools that we see for liquid manure. If we're looking down the center of that, and there is one coulter that cuts a slot in the soil, and then the tube pours in the liquid manure at the right rate, and the two coulters to the back that are angled in, those cover up the slot, and they therefore they reduce the exposure of the manure to the air, but they mix it the manure into the soil at the same time. And here's an example of how we're transmitting the liquid manure from the farm. So on the left, this is portable pumps that are agitating the manure in the pit of this swine building, and they're pumping it out through a hose at over 1,000 gallons a minute to the what we call the drag line or umbilical line going to the field. So in the center, we see the toolbar and the tractor dragging this hose back and forth through the field, and a rear view in the right-hand side that you get to see out the tractor cab. So if you look down through there, and you can see all the hoses that carry a uniform amount all across the width of this toolbar. And if you look at the soil here where this device is passed, we see that there's just a minimum amount of soil disturbance. There's still the crop residue is left on top of the soil, and that's always a good thing because we get less soil erosion if we leave crop residue on the top instead of stirring up all the soil. This is an example of some of the modern equipment out there, and this is one of our custom manure haulers in Western Illinois that uses this every year. We do the same thing with solid and semi-solid manure. It's applied on a tons per acre basis, and we did a field day. I'm just showing a calibration field day here where we got some local students to come out and help us weigh the manure that was spread on this tarp, and then we convert that to tons per acre. Have to show the old beater on the axle, the old John Deere Model E spreader. There's way back there. We've come a long way since the old John Deere spreader back in '36. We see on the right here, this is one of our modern semi-solid spreaders spreading the dairy manure solids. And again, this is our calibration field demonstration a few years ago, but you see how much width and how we can very carefully control the spread of that manure on this acreage. So I'm going to skip a couple of these, one more example, because one of these is about the dietary changes that have taken place recently. But I just want to make the point that we're doing a much better job of making manure a more complete fertilizer that exactly matches what our crops require, much better than we did before, about 1995, actually. So rather recent change in the technology, and it's virtually industry-wide that we're able to match up that nitrogen and phosphorus ratio that we need for the Illinois crops. We see the effect of all these things taken together, the technology, the training, and so on. And this thing from Illinois Farm Bureau shows that the livestock-related complaints, the Illinois EPA, you see how it's steadily fallen since 1996. That was the Livestock Management Facilities Act, and when this training actually began. And so we've seen the complaints drop steadily since then. So we're doing something right. I mean, we engineers like to talk about all of the ways that we get involved in this, but all the way from the storage, runoff control, transport, and the land application. So just pat myself on the back one last time before I close here on the engineering. So I would say, I hope I've made the case that our livestock farmers are really concerned about a good water quality. And there are these various incentives and constraints that work together to make it happen. So we've got technology, we got some financial incentives, we got technical help, and we got a lot of producer education, and of course the environmental regulations that really build a framework on how things should be done. This Illinois Farm Families website is an interesting place to look at examples of how technology is working today. So it's watchusgrow.org if you'd like to see the various farm families being highlighted across the state. So with that, I'll stop for questions or comments.
Thanks, Ted. There was one question in the chat box, and it is from Joe O'Connor. Any reason we couldn't utilize the side dressing application for septage from septic tanks?
Good question. I don't see any reason why I couldn't. There are, of course, there are specific regulations for applying domestic sewage, or for that matter, for sewage solids from commercial, from municipal sewage systems. So yeah, there's no reason why it couldn't. If it can be pumped, it can be, it could be applied on, could be side dressed. So something to look at. Good question.
I'm not seeing any further questions. So Ted, thank you for your presentation. I would like to remind all of our participants that if you have not already done so, please enter your email into the chat box, and we will take a quick, looks like 7-minute break here until our 3 o'clock presentation. All right, welcome back, everybody. Just another reminder, one more time, if you haven't put your email into the chat box, that's where we will be collecting those for continuing education credits. So just make sure that you've done that at least one time today. Our next presentation is from Steve Wilson on groundwater and wells, water quality and well issues common in Illinois. So Steve, I believe you should have sharing capabilities at this point.
Thank you, Eleni. Did that work?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me. Again, my name is Steve Wilson. I'm with the State Water Survey here at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. I want to mention Walt Kelly, the head of our groundwater section, who in the end, this presentation I put together, I borrowed a number of slides from Walt and realized that most of this talk he probably should be giving. And so a lot of these slides are his. He's really the water quality expert in our group. And so I'm just borrowing a lot of material from him. A lot of interesting stuff going on in Illinois, though. And, you know, it's interesting when Justin contacted me about participating in this, I said, well, water quality is a pretty broad topic. What do you want me to talk about? And his response was, well, we're all public health professionals and we all take your classes, or a lot of us do. And we're, you know, what would you want us to know? And so I thought that was a really great way of framing it. And so I'm going to start off really by talking about kind of as an outline of what I hope you get out of this today. First is that, you know, water quality issues are always evolving. So, you know, recently it's been, you know, lead and now PFAS, but there's always some new emerging thing on the horizon. You know, 15 years ago, it was pharmaceuticals and personal care products. And along with those emerging things or new contaminants that come along that we weren't really aware of or didn't really realize were an issue, you know, lead's been a problem for 100 years. There are others that have, they're naturally occurring. They're just in our groundwater and they'll always be there. And so they're things we just have to deal with. Private, semi-private, non-community wells, which is really your area of interest, mostly managed as private wells, whether they're a non-community system or not. So many of those owners are not trained in providing safe water. They're not, now I realize they may be licensed operators or may have somebody looking over their shoulder, but many of these small businesses aren't in business to provide water. They have another purpose. And so providing safe water and following all the regulations under the Safe Drinking Water Act are really just a nuisance to them. They don't have the same buy-in that you get from a community water supply operator. And so that makes it a challenge. I'm sure you're all aware as to what they should do when, you know, new regs come along. You know, the changes that we're going to have in some of our regs are going to be an influence certainly on some of those businesses, and some may even close. As a private well professional, I see that there are two issues that we really need to deal with. One are poorly constructed wells, which, you know, because wells are grandfathered in, we see many wells that are 100 years old still. You know, I just had a colleague here at work who had a well that was drilled in 1946. It's 3.5 inch diameter and it had a jet pump in his basement. And it finally, the check valve on went bad. And obviously they just put in a new well this week, $11,000. And so those will eventually all change, obviously, as wells fail or issues with the system fail. But we see so many wells still even in pits or old dug wells, which I grew up on an old dug well. And the other issue is lack of well owner knowledge, which, you know, from where I sit with our private well class program is something that we hopefully can change, and we're trying to change. Again, it's a lot of folks believe that their wells are safe because they're getting groundwater and don't understand that, you know, you really don't know unless you test and all those issues. So for all the other things that come up and are an issue or hit the news, really, I believe if we could work on these two issues, we'd make a lot more headway into raising the level of knowledge of well owners in Illinois. And lastly, the one thing that I've noticed over the last 10 or 12 years or so is that there's a big rise in the amount of research being done on related to private wells and public health. Also on environmental justice issues related to that, to private wells or drinking water. And it's, so it's really kind of a good time to be involved with these issues and be a part of a program that works on these issues. 10 years ago, when I went to look for research papers related to interventions related to private wells, it was a real struggle. And now today, there's really there's just a lot of research being done. There's graduate programs that focus just on private well related research and public health, as well as environmental justice. And so it's just an opportunity. I think we're going to see a lot more of that research being translated into usable information as we move forward in the next few years. I sure hope so. So a little bit on water quality, just, we're really concerned with drinking water quality and public health, but we also have issues related to ecological issues because, groundwater typically discharges to streams or rivers or wetlands. And in those cases, we see how contamination of a shallow aquifer can affect a stream. I'm going to talk about chlorides in a little bit and how much that's changed some of the rivers in the Northeast part of Illinois. And then there's also contamination, could be human or natural, anthropogenic. We've certainly caused a lot of our own problems, and others are just there and we need to deal with them, or we already have and know what to do. It's just becomes a matter of how much it costs and whether well owners are informed and understand those risks. And then again, point source versus non-point sources is always an issue and has been for the last 30 years. There are standards, obviously, for community water supplies through the Safe Drinking Water Act, and I guess non-community supplies. You can go to EPA's webpage and find these MCLs for a lot of contaminants that we do have naturally in groundwater. Radium, arsenic, barium, we all find in Illinois, and I'm going to go through some of that stuff, as well as things that we cause through, our own use. The interesting thing about groundwater is, one, if you weren't aware, the equations of groundwater flow are the same as the equations for electric flow, K equals CIA. And so you can model, like the diagram on the right, what'll happen using the equations of flow for groundwater and setting it up as a grid with a three-dimensional model. And, we do this type of work, and a lot of times, folks do all over the country, and it really depends on the geology and how uniform things are. And there's a lot of complications, but you can get a generalized idea of where a plume is going to go just based on the geology and a few water level measurements. And so it's interesting in that respect. There certainly are issues. I know a lot of the work done at Illinois, even back in the 80s and 90s, looked at flow through the shallow soil layers. Those may be dry and have cracks, and so it doesn't follow traditional flow through saturated soil. But we've learned enough about the science related to groundwater movement that now we can predict in a lot of cases when there's a spill or there's some sort of issue, what's going to happen. And that's really important for understanding water quality in those cases, or if a dump site's uncovered. I know a few years ago, a lawyer contacted us at the Water Survey looking for records for a chemical plant down by East St. Louis that used to bury all their drums. And they had no information that showed where that burial site might be. We dug through our records. The Water Survey is 126 years old, and we uncovered a blueprint of the whole facility from 1946 that had the burial location marked on it. And so you just never know and now they can determine where that's gone and what the causes are, if it's moved off site, all those sorts of things. So in Illinois, we really have three sets of groundwater systems. We have the deep bedrock, which outcrops in some places, but in the Chicago area, for instance, it's down below 1,000 feet. And I'll talk more about that wavy line later. You know, the geology isn't such that it's such a smooth transition from aquifer and not being aquifer. That's a water quality line. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. We have shallow bedrock in parts of the state that are a viable aquifer. And then we have our sand and gravel aquifers. I know Ted showed the Muhammad earlier. You know, it's one of the most extensive sand and gravel aquifers in the state. It's used by a lot of folks, a lot of irrigation, especially in Mason and Tazewell County. And it's a pretty prolific aquifer. It's, you know, as thick as 200 feet of sand. And when you consider porosities somewhere between 20 and 30%, if you have 200 feet of sand, that's 40 to 60 feet of water if you took all the sand away. So there's a lot of water available there. In Champaign County, the Muhammad is buried under two other sets of glaciation. So the Muhammad doesn't start until about 140 feet, depending on where you are out in the county, versus Mason County, where the aquifer is at the surface. And we have direct infiltration as well as direct infiltration of things at the surface that can be a problem and contaminate an aquifer. So talk about natural water quality issues first. And there are natural chlorides. These come from, you know, salt water. The lower part of the state was an inland sea millions of years ago. That water is still held in the bedrock. And so what we see is if you drill into that unit, you're going to get, you know, chlorides or TDS, total dissolved solids, in the tens of thousands. It's just like salt water if you were at the ocean today. And not drinkable. It's a lot to desalinate, expensive. And so it's really not considered a water supply, which is why that line is on the deep bedrock map. Because below that, the chlorides or the total dissolved solids increase significantly as you move south. There are areas where that's shallow. And we also see, I know there's an area near Bement, Illinois, which I believe is in DeWitt County, that the Muhammad aquifer has saltwater upwelling from the bedrock below. And we see a few homes in that area with private wells that have chloride values well above 250, the taste threshold. And they're treating their water because it has a salty taste, or they have you know, a service for their drinking water. Arsenic, you know, arsenic's the 7th most common element in the Earth's crust. We have a fair amount of it in Illinois. It's usually found in our sand and gravel aquifers. Obviously, Tazewell County, if you're familiar with arsenic in Illinois, is an area of, you know, high interest because there's a lot of arsenic there, both in the Muhammad aquifer, which sits on top of the bedrock, as well as the shallower Glassford, which is from a later glaciation. And there's no rhyme or reason. I know when all that was discovered, in the 80s, a landfill went in near Hopedale, and someone sampled their well a few miles away and found arsenic at over 200 parts per billion. They threw up a red flag, and the whole area felt like it was probably because of the landfill. So the Illinois EPA and the Tazewell County Health Department sampled over 500 wells, and sure enough, they found a significant amount of arsenic. But it obviously wasn't caused by the landfill. It's naturally occurring. And it's led to a lot of research we've done in that area, just looking at, you know, rhyme or reason as far as where to drill to try to miss that if you can, or if it's more shallower or deeper, all those sorts of things. And there really isn't. It's really hit or miss. It's based on the chemistry. More reducing conditions tend to lead to more arsenic being released from the soil matrix. And it's just a tenable problem that you don't know until you drill. Radium and barium are both constituents found in the deep bedrock in Illinois, especially in the northern third of the state where it's used as a water supply. And both of these obviously have health effects. Radium is a carcinogen. And so these are all issues that you all should be aware of depending on what county you're in and things. You know, the communities know these issues, and we'll use community data a lot today because we have information on those wells. But you know, most private well owners aren't testing for radium necessarily or barium when they even if they do get a water test. And so there are things to be aware of. So again, this is the deep aquifer in Illinois, and that wavy line, as I mentioned, is the area where the TDS is above 2000, and as you go south, it gets higher. These are, I believe these are all community water supply samples and show that as you move south, it gets higher. The real problem with this long term is that because of pumpage in the Chicago area, you know, there's a lot going on now. Joliet's going to go off of the deep aquifer and go on to Lake Michigan, but there's a number of other supplies up there that use the deep bedrock aquifer. They're causing a cone of depression that's causing the higher TDS or chloride water to migrate north. So it may be several hundred years or so, but if the use in the aquifer continues the way it has, eventually we'll all be treating to remove that in order to make it drinkable. And so the latest use of the deep bedrock, Bloomington Normal, or Bloomington, I believe, put in a number of deep wells, or a deep well near Lake Evergreen and they're blending in order for the water to be usable. Okay, arsenic. I mentioned arsenic. Well, you know, in 2006, the arsenic rule changed. It was promulgated in 2001, but actually took effect in 2005 and 2006. In Illinois, we had about 50 or 60 facilities, I believe, that were not going to meet the new arsenics or did not meet the old standard in retreating. It's typically a sand and gravel problem in Illinois, and where in other states there may be really high values in the bedrock. We just don't have a lot of it in our bedrock. But then when the rule changed to 10, it meant a lot more wells weren't going to meet that standard. And we see a lot of issues related to that as far as treatment. We have communities that may have a source water that's in the 40s, and they're able to use filtration and green sand and a few other techniques to lower that, but close to 10. And you know, there's times where they're out of compliance. But we have a lot of private well owners who drink the water, swear it's fine. I know a number of years ago, McLean, Illinois was looking at for an alternate water supply. They're able to treat their water and keep the arsenic below 10 to stay in compliance, but it's pretty close. And so we worked with them and sampled, I believe, 7 or 8 homes that were within 2 or 3 miles of McLean just to see what their arsenic levels were. And in every case, they were higher than the 40s that McLean's public well had. And so there really was nowhere around McLean to find a lower supply. We have a number of monitoring wells out in McLean, Tazewell, and Logan County for the work we did back in the 90s for the Long Range Water Plan Steering Committee, looking at water resource evaluation at the time. And most of those wells have arsenic, at least in the 20s or higher, except one. We have one well that it's always around 3 or 4 ppb. It's out in the middle of nowhere, not too close to any communities, unfortunately. So it's a real problem everyone needs to treat. We still have communities, or at least I should say some community supplies. They may be not a typical residential community, but a mobile home park, for instance, they're out of compliance and still in violation. But the real issue are private well owners in these areas, especially in Tazewell, McLean, in the Mahomet part of that aquifer. We did a study, I want to say around 2008 or so, where we sampled in 2 rural subdivisions that were in Tazewell County. So these were, some of the homes, well, actually in one case, the wells were these were all less than 1 acre lots. And there were 20 or 30 homes. So it's probably less than 40, to be honest, 40 acres total, less than a quarter mile square. And we saw arsenic values that ranged over an order of magnitude different. And again, it's the source, it's right at the well, the chemistry, how oxidation changes things if it does, and the makeup of the aquifer material right near the well that seems to affect arsenic values. And it's really like a shotgun. It's all over the place, and you can't predict it until you actually put in a well and sample it. I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. So we've done a lot of work on the Mahomet, mainly because we know there's arsenic there. And you can see here, as you travel through, there is some arsenic in Champaign County, but not nearly as much as you move further west and you get into Tazewell. Some of those wells look nested, and that's because we did a study specifically looking at different depths in the same aquifer. So we found 3 wells that were close to each other, that were either near the top of the aquifer or near the bottom of the aquifer. We were hoping to see some differences. And in the end, there was no difference. There was no rhyme or reason, no statistical way to show that, putting a well towards the top of the aquifer, again, it's in some places it's over 200 feet thick, and it's confined. So it's artesian, and water levels in wells in the Mahomet over there typically rise well above the top of the aquifer. But we saw there's no way to really determine what you're going to find, or if it's lower or higher. In many cases, they're the same throughout the entire depth. And I mentioned the Glassford. It's the shallower sands that are above the Mahomet. You can see it's in patches. So as the glaciers melted and things were washed away, it wasn't as extensive. So the aquifer is not as thick. We see a lot of areas where these small units are 10 or 15 feet thick instead of 100 or more. And so it's more patchy. But again, the source grain material there and that sand has arsenic in it. And so we certainly see arsenic in the water samples we collect. So another issue is radium. And this is an older slide. It says data from 2004 to 2007. But at the time we were looking at, which are over the MCL for radium is 5 picocuries per liter. And so there were over 200 water supplies in Illinois with at least 1 well over that 5. And so more recent data that Walt put together, again, still over 200 wells, but you can see there's a little more information in other parts of the state where they might be using bedrock. And it's not just an Illinois problem. It's all through the Midwest. Radium is a cancer risk. In some places it's significant. And there aren't a lot of private wells that go to the deep aquifer, except in a few places. I know Campton Township, I think it's in McHenry County, there are hundreds of wells I believe, that all go to the deep aquifer that are all for single homes. And so there's a lot to be aware of, and knowing what type of well a person has, assuming, a long time ago, or I'd say in the olden days, they would have just put in a dug well. But now we have, $2 million homes in some of those places, and they can afford to do those things. So they do. And you got to be careful and understand what water quality risks you might have. Same thing with barium. I'm not real familiar with I know barium is a regulated contaminant, and we do see a lot of it in the deep bedrock. And you can see here, the standard is 1. And these are all the wells that we've sampled that are over 1. And so it's fairly active in the area. And so it's just something you should assume you're going to find if you have a well that's in the deep aquifer in that area. The interesting thing about barium is it is controlled by sulfate. So you can see here on this graph that typically when you have sulfate in the water, you don't have barium release. And then as soon as the sulfate disappears, all of a sudden you start seeing higher values. And it's interesting because the same thing happens with arsenic. We see that when there's in the Mahomet in Tazewell County, when there is still sulfate in the water, we see sulfate reducing bacteria that exist in the aquifer and the groundwater. If that's all used up, the water gets more reduced, the bacteria that take over are methanogenic bacteria. And all of a sudden we start seeing a lot of arsenic being released. And a grad student from the Department of Geology worked with using our wells and some other data from Tazewell County. This is in the early 90s, I believe, and made that relationship. Actually, it had to be in the early 2000s because our wells went in from 92 to 94, and developed that relationship and found that situation in that aquifer. It's kind of unique. But it's chemically, or it's mediated by the type of bacteria and the level of reducing chemistry that's in the groundwater, whether or not you're going to have release of those contaminants. So if you want more information, if you're not familiar, if you just Google US EPA primary drinking water standards, you can get to this page. I just showed a little piece of it, but it goes through all of the 90 plus regulated contaminants under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And I bring that up because one, non-community systems need to meet a portion of those. And for private wells or shared wells that are considered private wells, and typically we all just use those as a safe level. You know, obviously there's no legal requirement for a well to meet, you know, the arsenic standard of 10 parts per billion. But at the same time, we can have confidence letting a well owner know that it's probably unsafe above that level based on the work that's been done to create the MCL. You know, especially in Tazewell County, I worked over there a lot in the 90s and stuff. And so many people are like, well, my grandpa lived on this well and drank it for years and never got sick. And that very well may be. And I'm sure you all have heard the story a million times. So, but it's how we get that message out is still a tough nut to crack, to convince people that well water needs to be tested. And if it's not considered safe, it needs to be treated. I know even my dad, we had an old dug well, and he swore that our well water was better than city water because cities put chemicals in their water, and that's not good for your body. Not understanding that adding chlorine or other things were to make the water better for us. As far as anthropogenic water quality issues in Illinois, one of the big ones is road salt, especially in the metro area in Chicago and East St. Louis. It's very soluble, so it ends up in our soil and our groundwater, even our rivers, and that's just the way it is. It's been applied virtually every year to all the roads we have. There's some work now to do things a little differently. You know, we spray a salt solution on our roads, so it uses much less salt and doesn't waste nearly as much. But because we've applied it for so many years before any of those things took hold, there's a lot of salt and available to migrate down into our groundwater. And again, it's a bigger issue in urban areas. Same with nitrate. We've seen nitrate concentrations increasing in our shallow aquifers for the last 40 or 50 years, especially in agricultural rural areas. And then lastly, pathogenic microbes. These are from a lot of times from livestock or septic. Where we see these being a problem are in vulnerable geologies. And I'll show you an example in a minute. So for road salt, you know, it's, I thought this was a fascinating slide. 100,000 tons of salt applied per year in the Chicago metro area. And so, you know, all that's ended up in our shallow groundwater or in our rivers. And so it really causes a problem. I had a video that showed for Kane County, how the amount of chloride in the shallow groundwaters changed since 1966. And I could not get it to play whenever I tried to run this. So I didn't include it, but it really shows that it's affected not only surface water, but the shallow dolomite up there as well. And again, because it's so soluble, it ends up in all of our water resources. And that ends up, you know, following the hydrologic cycle where it's not supposed to be. So for Kane County, again, we did some work up there. Our Walton team did a number of years ago. This data goes through 2010, but it's a historical record of chloride values in these wells, these shallow wells that are either in sand and gravel or shallow dolomite. And you can see the shallowest wells have the highest levels, and the deepest well, the 196-foot well, hasn't increased nearly as much, but it's migrating through, and it will. It will keep increasing for the foreseeable future. And so in some cases, those wells have to be blended, or it'll have to be treated eventually in order to be usable as a public water supply. And yeah, I neglected to mention about 14% of road salt annually is the estimate that remains in long-term storage in the soil that, you know, can migrate after a large rainstorm or some kind of runoff event. Same thing with nitrate. You know, we use nitrate, speaking of non-point source pollution, is so heavily used for agricultural purposes that these are communities, you know, I grew up near Mount Pulaski, where in this data only goes through 2000, but you can see how nitrate levels have crept up in a number of community water supplies that are in rural agricultural areas. And again, these are all shallow wells. They're all less than 100 feet deep, but in some cases that may be the only aquifer available to a community. And so, you know, there's some, it's just a matter of treating. And again, when it gets back to the private well owner or a small non-community water supply, that's a pretty expensive proposition, or they have to find an alternative. Walt did some work at the Mason State Tree Nursery a number of years ago, looking at how nitrate disappears with depth due to denitrification. Don't worry about the math. I'm not a chemist either. But what he found is, you know, over there in a lot of Mason County, the depth of water could be less than 10 feet. And near Easton, it's 4 feet. Up closer to Forest City, it might be closer to 40 feet. But there's typically about 80 to 100 feet of saturated sand. And as the infiltrated water moves through the soil and aquifer column and moves down, it does go away. It gets denitrified. And so we see with depth that, you know, the nitrate isn't making its way all the way down to the bottom of the aquifer. You know, there's a lot of sand points over there because, especially in the areas where they're near the river or a lake, or it's the water table is really shallow. What we recommend to well owners is, you know, sand points are not safe. They're too close to the surface, and with sandy soil at the surface, you're going to see infiltration of anything that gets on the ground, whether that be fertilizer, or you're spraying your yard, or, you know, putting bug dust on your garden, or any of those things. Over time, it could eventually be a problem. And you know, I always say that if I was going to buy property in Mason County and put in a well, I would drill down until they hit bedrock, and I'd put my screen right at the bottom, right in the sand and gravel, but right at the bottom of bedrock. Sand is a great natural filter, and it's a matter of you know, getting as far away from the surface as you can. The other thing is we have karst in Illinois, and so you can see the karst areas on the map and all the sinkholes that are listed here. You know, when you drive through these areas, sometimes you see where they've thrown old woven wire fence or pieces of metal, or even cars, junk cars, into these sinkholes, not realizing that's a direct conduit into the aquifer. I know it's probably been 10 or 15 years ago, but in Pike County, they were looking at putting in their regional or an extension to the regional water supply that goes through the county. And the health department there, 80% of the samples they collect have either coliform or nitrate, or coliform or E. coli. And that's just the nature of karst topography. You know, it's just caves and sinkholes are direct conduits. There's no filtration. And typically in those areas, if there's, you know, we also were involved in a study where we were using DNA to determine whether the bacteria were from human, cow, cattle, hogs, horses, and that is possible today. And you can kind of trace the local source that way if you find that in a well. It's just, in some cases, folks aren't either taking care of their septic system discharge correctly. You still see straight pipes to some of our streams and rivers from a septic unit. I have a colleague who we tried to map his lateral lines and found that they actually run into field tile directly. And this was done in the 40s or 50s. So yeah, you never know what you're going to find when you go to a private well, but there's obviously a lot of sources of those things. And this is just, Walt has done a lot of work looking at karst areas, and some of the sampling they've done in these, either where there's a spring coming out of a sinkhole area, or they went in and sampled in caves where they found a lot of bacterium problems. Yeah. The other types of issues that have come up in the last 15 or 20 years are pharmaceuticals and personal care products. Most work there has looked at vulnerable geologies. Typically, you see a lot of septic systems that discharge to a shallow groundwater system. You'll find, caffeine or, one of the, like Advil or Aleve type products in those areas. They're usually, as I said, I'm getting ahead of myself. And then today, there's a lot of work being done looking at microplastics. These are, really tiny pieces of plastic. They find them everywhere they look, just like PFAS, to be honest. You can find microplastics in every water environment. There's different types, which I'll show you in a second, but there's just a lot not understood yet to understand the health effects, though some of the current research suggests that, one, they increase cancer risks, they can cause lesions, neurotoxicity, and that there was a laundry list of other things that they're studying to determine if they maybe have an impact. And so I know Walt has done some work looking at microplastics in karst and springs type areas. This is all the things they sampled for. And again, naproxen is Aleve and ibuprofen's Advil. There's a lot of other chemicals here. We tell folks not to put like penicillin, or not penicillin, amoxicillin into their, to flush those things because they get in your septic, but we see a lot of stuff that does. And again, anything that's an antibacterial is going to affect your septic system as well, and kill the bacteria that are there to try to break everything else down. So in their study, they sampled different times of the year, as many as 13 springs and caves. And the cave streams are basically where a cave entrance to a cave, where it's actually a stream that you can walk into. And it's interesting, naproxen, which is Aleve, they found it every time, where ibuprofen, obviously different chemistry, was only found one time. But certainly there's some things that exist more readily in these environments that we're putting into our water systems. And basically, microplastics are very small pieces of plastic. They can be microbeads or microfibers or polyethylene. And we have something go by, sorry. There's so much plastic in our environment that recently they, in 2015, banned polyethylene as part of health or beauty products, just because it shows up everywhere. It's the most dominant polymer found in treated wastewater discharging from wastewater treatment plants. You can see how small these things are, but they're really everywhere. And so what they're going to cause as far as health effects is still to be determined. So they sampled in both Northwest Illinois and Southwest Illinois in the karst regions. And it's interesting, 70% were blue or clear in color. I'm not sure why that's significant. I probably should have asked Walt before I gave this presentation. But yeah, so karst aquifers are a risky thing. And they, here it says the most likely source are from washing machines. And I know I read somewhere that, a typical garment that has microplastics in it loses, I can't remember the number, 2.7. I apologize. But anyway, every time you wash it. And so that's going down your discharge, goes out through your septic system. And so you're seeing those things get into the environment that way. Okay, so I'm not going to talk much about lead or PFAS today, just because just want to mention it. Obviously, it's an issue. You know, lead is a premise plumbing issue. We've known lead's been a problem for a long time, but even when the EPA regulated lead under the lead and copper rule, they didn't set the limit at 0. I think that's partially because there's so many, literally millions of miles of lead pipe. There's no way to fix that in short order. Now we're seeing a huge push to do that. The thing that is being done today through the Infrastructure Act and the Lead Act and all the things that they're doing now to provide resources to switch out lead service lines doesn't get to the point of lead pipes or copper pipes with lead solder or galvanized pipes in homes. That's still up to the homeowner. And I imagine replacing an entire home full of lead pipes would be quite expensive. And so even after we've, the communities fix all those sorts of issues with lead service lines, we're still going to have the issue of lead pipes in homes, or again, lead solder and galvanized pipe. Any home before really 2014 could have lead solder, and before like 1983 in Illinois could have lead pipes. And so I know we had a Kelsey Piper, Dr. Kelsey Piper from now Northeastern. She was at Virginia Tech. She'd done some research looking at lead in private homes or in homes with private wells, and found significant issues, especially in Virginia, where the pH of the water is much lower and it's more corrosive than we have in Illinois. And they found, you know, they're seeing lead an hour after running a faucet continuously, which, you know, typically advice is run it for a few minutes to get new water in the lines, and it's less likely to have as much lead. And even though it's still true, it doesn't mean that there's none, or that no particulate lead has been able to come off the while the water's running. And so the good thing is, you know, the amount of lead exposure in total is certainly gone down over the years, in the last 30 or 40 years. And that's really because of all the work to replace other sources of lead, like lead paint or gasoline and some of those things. And so it has gone down, but now water has probably a more prominent role because of lead pipes and the fact that we have so many homes that still have those systems in them. And regarding PFAS, you know, there's no good solution here. I don't know what's going to happen. States are starting to regulate PFAS in their water, in their public water systems. Each state's taking its own tact. Some are higher, some are lower. You know, the EPA has a health advisory at 70 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS, but there's several thousand PFAS chemicals. Many haven't been studied that much. And really, it's a matter of, there's no simple solution. Honestly, the only solution will require a lot of changes in the way we live. And given us the example we've had with masks and during the pandemic, I think we're going to be living with PFAS for a long time. And it's a matter of, we need to understand it better. There's certainly a lot of research going on today looking at ways to treat it. But again, most of that's going to benefit public water supplies, not private well owners. And so, yeah, I don't really know what the solution is going to be there. I guess if you're in a rural area and you're away from a lot of influences, you're less likely to have PFAS at any level. You may have other routes of exposure that are more of an issue. But yeah, I think we're going to be talking about PFAS for the, you know, as long as I'll be involved with a lot of these issues, for sure. What I do see though is, you know, like when the arsenic rule changed, I was doing some work for US EPA then, looking at non-community water supplies, and where they thought a lot of non-community water supplies would just add treatment, they either, and this was all 6 Midwestern states in region 10 or region 5, they didn't just add treatment. they either hooked up to a public water supply or many of them just closed their business. And I see the same thing happening once some of the PFAS rules start taking effect and it becomes more of a national requirement or states start being more strict. I think you'll see a lot of non-community systems that just can't afford to treat it necessarily like we did, around 2005 and 6. So as far as what drives well owners, I'm shown that if you've been on our webinars, you've seen some of these, but media really drives the train. So when Flint happened with lead, and now with all the things on PFAS, we see a lot more people calling us and asking about those issues. And I'm sure you get more calls about those things as well. So when there's a flood or a drought or fracking, livestock facilities, or even boil orders, this is a great example to me because it indicates that some well owners really don't understand where their water's coming from or what risks they have. And that's frustrating to me as someone who tries to educate well owners. But anytime there's a boil order in the local paper, I've had a number of water operators in those communities tell me that they get calls from private well owners that live outside of town somewhere asking if it's safe for them to drink their water, not understanding that that boil order is there because they had a main break. And so they're trying to protect, the closed loop system of a public water supply. And so I've also had water operators tell me that they've had calls from people saying their water wasn't working. And when they go to investigate that, find that those people aren't on their water system, they actually have a private well. And so the folks didn't even realize they were on their own well. And that could be that, one spouse is always taking care of the well and the other one had no clue. Who knows, but it's happened more than a few times. And so the issue with that is when these things happen, we need to take advantage of educating well owners about what is real and what is the truth and what they do need to do. Because again, I'll go back to what I started with here. I think these are the most serious and correctable issues that we have for protecting public health with private wells. And that's educating people about wells in general and upping their knowledge so they understand how to take care of their well and be a good steward of their well and aquifer, as well as correcting poor well construction and trying to influence some of those decisions. A third thing that's an issue is definitely abandoned wells that may be in an area. There's probably as many abandoned wells that aren't filled in as there are wells in use in Illinois. And that's also kind of frustrating. So for our role, it's a tough situation. In many cases, when there are well-related issues, we get a call from someone. A lot of times I'm referring them to the USDA or the Water Systems Council also has a program to put in wells for folks. But it's clear in many cases, I try to find a local source for a well owner if they're in a different state, someone who can help them. And they just aren't prepared and may not have the wherewithal to take care of their wells. There's also the issue of funds, and that's where it gets to the USDA has a program where it has to be very low income family in order to be eligible for those funds for well repair, septic repair, or a new well. And there are certainly cases where that helps, but there are many well owners who, many people are on a tight budget. I mentioned my colleague that just had to replace his well. It was $11,000. And just one day, all of a sudden, you live out in the country in a rural area and you don't have water, you can't take a shower, you can't cook, you can't do anything. You need to have a well in place pretty quickly. And so it only took them 2 days, but then they spent $11,000. And not a lot of us would be able to just put that out right like that. So the private well class, that we manage here at the U of I provides well owners with lessons to help them understand what the responsibilities are. And we also give advice. We try to find resources for them or find an expert in their local area. I said someone, honestly, this happened this morning, someone from Kansas called me about getting a water sample. They'd seen our brochure and thought we were with this local group in Kansas. And after she explained the situation, I looked it up online and gave her the phone number. I mean, that's my job. My job is to get well owners to all of you and others that can give them local information and understand your area better. And we take that pretty seriously too. What we offer for professionals, and I know most of you are aware of this, but maybe not everyone, we have a 10-lesson class that's on NEHA's e-learning site where you can get an hour CEU credit for each of the 10 lessons through NEHA. We also do monthly webinars that are available for both NEHA CEUs and Illinois LEHP credit. And I know, yeah, Justin, I talked about that whenever we were preparing for today. And we put out a monthly newsletter. If you don't get it, you probably should. It's really for professionals. It highlights new information we find maybe on the web or events that are going on that might be useful. And then we started a podcast. You should check it out. It's called drinkingwaterpodcast.org. But we did our first season, 12 episodes last fall. We're just starting. I think the first episode this year was released last Thursday, and there'll be one this Thursday, and we'll do 12 more. And it's really, we bring in experts on both the public drinking water and the private well side, really at the intersection of public health where we can. We try to focus on some of those issues. And these are folks that all have an interesting story or involved in a program that we feel it would be of interest to others. And so, yeah. We also put on a conference it has been every other year. We did it in May of 17, 19, and 21. That's actually going to be annual from now on. It's May 24th through 26th this year. It's free. It's virtual again this year. It won't be next year, hopefully. And we try to move it around the country, but we record every presentation. And so you can go back and watch all 3 conferences that we've already had. What I will say, it's not a research conference. It's not meant to be a bunch of folks from universities who are doing their theoretical research on wells. It's folks that are out working with well owners. And they're all practical situations and issues that, our goal when we set up the talks for this conference are that county or local health department folks attend, and they have something they can take home and it'll make their job easier, better. And again, we also have a number of resources for well owners that you can find on our website. So a little bit about private wells and public health related to the work we do and others. So EPA recently completed this project. They've been working on it for 4 or 6 years, where they're looking at census data. The last time that water source was asked on the census was in 1990. So there's been no information since then on where people get their water. So like EPA's estimate of total wells in the country was 13 million, and they've left that up there forever. Well, they've using the housing survey, which is completed more regularly, they've extrapolated and used actual data from, I think, 14 states where they have good well log information to come up with a new estimate, if you will, of the number of wells around the country. I know it's been estimated in Illinois, there's about 500,000 to 600,000 wells that are actually water wells in use. I've always thought that was low. And I've always told people 800,000 because that's what I believe. And their estimate was 750 for Illinois that are actually in use. And so in their webinar, so they've estimated for the country, there's 23 million wells in use, which is almost 60 million people, which is more people than live in communities of 500 or less in the country, which, there's thousands of those all over the country. So it's a huge jump in the importance of private wells from the standpoint of the number of people that are actually using those wells and for protection of public health. And so I just wanted to mention that work was done. It was published last October. So if anybody would like a copy of that paper, I know it's out. I can probably get you a copy. The authors are from US EPA, Fran Kremer and Alex Hall. But they're actually presenting for our monthly webinar. It's tomorrow. They're actually going to do the webinar for us, and they're going to describe their work. And part of that is they developed all these GIS resources that you can use with your own data. So if any of you use GIS, I know a few counties certainly do. I was just talking to some folks from Massachusetts earlier today. They've taken this new data that they've made available in Massachusetts and developed a website so that you can look at any district in the state, in Massachusetts again, and find out how many wells there are there, and a lot of other demographics about those areas. So it breaks it down to, it goes down to census tract, so it's a pretty small level, so it's pretty useful. The water survey is also involved in some public health related water quality projects. And I want to mention that in October, we formed a new section. It's called Environmental Public Health Information and Data Services. I'm the section head. And because of our work with the private well class and the other program we have called wateroperator.org that supports small water and wastewater systems, we've decided to get more involved on the public health side. We hired an environmental health professional with a master's in environmental public health, and started in January. We're working on a project. I'll mention the first one first. Walt Kelly's involved with two public health professionals from University of Illinois at both Chicago and Urbana-Champaign. They're sampling 150 homes in Illinois in 5 counties for lead. I know that that's going through the county health departments in those counties. So those of you in those counties, I'm sure, are aware. And the cool thing about this project is they included funding, and HUD's provided funding to actually remediate homes where lead is found. And actually they're finding more lead than I would have imagined based on our water quality and chemistry and pH of our water. And that includes replacing all the pipes in a few people's homes. And so it's kind of exciting because that's really one of the problems we have is some well owners say to me, well, why should I test? If you find something, I can't afford to add treatment or to replace my pipes or do whatever. And this study is actually going to look at what happens when they're able to do that. So, and we also started a project. Legionella is an interesting bacteria, Legionella pneumophila. And so it's mostly considered a building issue and a water tower type issue or water tank issue. But a study was done through Virginia Tech a couple of years ago, where they found the percentage of homes that had measurable Legionella pneumophila was the same as for homes on a public water supply. Around 17% had culturable Legionella. Whether that translates to people getting Legionnaire's disease, we don't know. But the fact that in a community water supply, the water is chlorinated and has to have a chlorine residual through the end of the distribution system. And very, very few private wells are chlorinated. It seems likely that we may find more. I don't know, but we've got some funding to sample 60 homes in 3 or 4 of the same counties. Hopefully, we haven't talked to the folks there yet, are being using these homes that are being sampled for the lead study. And we're working with our civil engineering department here, as well as it's through our hazardous waste research fund through ISTC. But we hope to do that sampling in April and May this year. And just to see what's going on. If you think about it, those of you that deal with Legionella, nationally, only 4% of all the Legionella cases are actually from an outbreak. And in most cases, the only investigations that are done are from outbreaks. And so where do the other 96% of the Legionella cases come from? I don't think anyone really knows for sure. And so we're hoping we're doing 2 things. One, we're doing the sampling. The other is we're calling all the states' public health departments and asking how they track Legionella cases and if they ask about water source. And our new hire is actually doing that work. Her name is Natalie Kerr, and she's already reached out to most of the states more than once. And we've learned a few states do actually track water source. And we're hoping that they're going to provide us the data to take a look at that and see if there's any reason to be concerned about Legionella in homes with private wells. This all started because February of 21, I was asked about Legionella in private wells on one of our webinars. And I said, I don't really think it's an issue. And I've not heard of it being an issue. And someone, a public health professional, put in the chat and sent us a paper from Virginia Tech. And we realized that that wasn't the right answer. So anyway, that's what I have today. Let me stop sharing my screen. And I didn't leave much time for questions. I apologize.
Out the way IDOT expects
All
it.
right, thanks, Steve. There was one question in the chat. What time is the monthly webinar tomorrow and how do we sign up for it?
So you can sign up on privatewellclass.org. If you go to our website, there's a webinars and events tab at the top. If you click on that, it should take you to all the webinars that we have listed for this month and down the road. And it's at 1 o'clock. And normally our webinars these days are 2 hours. This one's going to be shorter than that, and it's worth 1 CEU through NEHA. Yeah, should be really interesting though if you're into anything related to mapping any of your water quality issues or public health issues. They're providing some really good data on where private wells are.
Be based on the city.
All
and
right,
the
thanks,
city's
Steve.
requirements.
I don't see any other questions in the chat box, so I'm going to turn it back over to Justin to wrap us up.
All right. Well, thank you very much to all of our speakers. Those were phenomenal topics. I definitely enjoyed listening to that. So day one is complete. We will see everybody back here on Thursday, and we will start in at 1 o'clock. Everyone have a great couple days until we see you then. Thanks.
Thanks, Justin.